Hey everybody, it's good to be back with you again. I hope that you're having a wonderful day today. I believe this will be either the fourth or fifth lesson that I've been able to bring to you during the coronavirus quarantine. I'm again here preaching to an empty church building. I made comment to a couple of folks last week that I'm actually getting kind of used to preaching standing up here by myself. Not something I ever thought I would be used to, not something I ever thought about doing, not something I ever thought about with recording my lessons and putting them up on YouTube more than just the audio versions. But here we are. Again, I'm glad to be able to come to you and to bring you this lesson. I hope that you are able to get something out of it. Of course, feel free to share this link with anybody who may benefit from hearing this lesson, and I hope that you gain some benefit from it as well. I know the last few weeks we've been really talking a lot about the current situation that we're dealing with, the current quarantine issue that we're under right now, and the fact that we can't meet, a lot of difficulties going on. But what I want to do today is I want to kind of start transitioning more back to the sermons that deal with our Christian living, with what we do from day to day. And so today I want to talk about Peter and 153 fish. Now, as you can see, this comes from John chapter 21, verses 9 through 17, and that's going to be the primary focus of our lesson a little bit later on. But one of the things that really is interesting to me is that when we think about the life of Peter and we think about all the things that he went through and all the things that happened to him, one of the things that we really zero in on a lot of time is the fact that Peter was a fisherman. He and his brother Andrew and their friends James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were all fishermen. And so when we think about what they did, we think about how Jesus called them, and we think about this entire story, the fact that we have 153 fish mentioned a little bit later on has some pretty significant importance. And it has importance not just in the things that Peter was dealing with, but it also has a lot of importance in the daily life of Peter, of Andrew, of James, and of John. And so these are some very important things that we're going to be talking about tonight as we think about Peter and as we think about these fish. Now, of course, this again, as I mentioned, comes from John chapter 21, the very last chapter of the Gospel of John, toward the last few verses of the last chapter of the Gospel of John. So we know that Jesus has already been through his trial, he's been through his crucifixion, he's been through the resurrection, he's preparing for the ascension, he's preparing the disciples for the coming of the church. So we see a lot of these things are already happening. But the story that we're looking at today starts about 3 years earlier. It starts about 3 years before the incident that we read about in John chapter 21. It starts off in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, where we read about Peter, Andrew, James, and John being called by Jesus to become his disciples. Now, of course, there were 8 other men who were called by Jesus. We know of the story of a couple of more of them, in particular Matthew, leaving the tax collector's table and following after him. But we want to look very carefully at the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, because this has some very powerful bearing on what we read about in John chapter 21. And so starting in verse 18, we read, "While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he," that being Jesus, "saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them." And finally in verse 22 we read, "Immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him." Now, this is significant because when we read about the calling of these 4 men, we have to understand what was going on. Fishing was a very difficult profession back in the 1st century. It's still a very difficult profession in the 21st century. Very challenging. And it's very hard to go and to establish a business and to continually go out day after day, night after night to fish and to catch these fish and to make it a family business. These guys were working really, really hard. They had established probably a pretty good life for themselves. They were probably good tradesmen. We understand that they knew what was going on. Peter, Andrew, and James, and John, and their families had some experience fishing. So it was a family business, and they had a pretty good life for themselves, as much as someone in the area of Galilee in the first century could have for themselves. And so this was something that was really difficult for them to leave when Jesus came along. And so he comes along and he says, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men." And both sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, as well as James and John, both turned and left their boats, they left their nets, they left their families, they left their business, they left their occupations, they left everything, and they followed after Jesus. Now, of course, we have to understand that they probably already knew who Jesus was. We do know that some of the disciples already knew who John was, and John had pointed some of these folks to Jesus, and so they had an idea of who they were following, and they also had to have some kind of an idea of what it meant for them to become fishers of men. And so Jesus comes along, Jesus calls them, and they leave everything behind, and they begin to follow him. Now, of course, there is a lot more to the story. Once you start reading, you read in the Gospels, you read about what the disciples did, you read about the parables that Jesus told them and the instructions that Jesus gave them. We read about all of the experiences that they had with Jesus. We read about them seeing people raised from the dead. We read about Jesus calming the storm over the Sea of Galilee, and while they were terrified that they were going to die. We read about them witnessing Jesus casting the demons out of the demonically possessed people during the course of their ministry. We read about all of these things and all of these powerful, powerful incidents that are recorded in the gospel. We read about them, and we know that these men were involved in that work for 3 full years. But after 3 years, Jesus is crucified. Now, this is not something to be taken lightly. This is not something that doesn't have a powerful impact on these guys, because remember, they had left everything behind. They had left it all behind, and they followed after Jesus. They had turned their lives over to him. They had heard his word. They had heard the message. They had developed an understanding of the message, and they had developed faith in Jesus. Remember, even before this, Jesus had asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter acknowledged that he was the Son of God. Remember, Peter and James and John had been on that Mount of Transfiguration when they heard the voice of God cry out that Jesus was his beloved Son. And so they knew, sort of, who Jesus was. And then they saw him go to the cross. And they saw him crucified. They saw him give up the ghost. And so they were scattered. It says in the scriptures at the Garden of Gethsemane that the disciples, when the guards came to seize Jesus, the disciples fled. As a matter of fact, one of the guards grabbed a hold of one young man by the cloak, and the disciple threw off his cloak so he could escape, and he escaped unclothed, or improperly clothed, as it were. Church tradition has it that is actually John Mark, who is the young man who sees there, the author of the Gospel of Mark. But we see that they run. And only John stays close by. He's kind of nearby. And so we see that Peter is so terrified at the loss of Jesus, at the crucifixion of Jesus, when he's asked by a slave girl in the courtyard if he was a disciple, he says, "No, I don't even know the man." And he swore an oath, "I don't even know who he is." And so they saw him down the cross. But of course, that's not where the story ends. Before we get to John chapter 21, there were a lot of other things that were going on at that point in time. We also know that the disciples had seen the empty tomb. Remember that Martha and Mary had gone to the tomb, and they had seen that the tomb was empty, so they ran back and they told Peter and they told John that the tomb was empty, and the disciples took off running, and John beats Peter to the tomb, remember? But Peter goes in first, and he gets there, and he sees that the body of Jesus is not there. He sees that the grave clothes that he would have been wearing had been folded up and placed where the body had been laying. And he realizes that the body of Jesus is gone. And they couldn't even mourn him. But Jesus turned out to no longer be dead. Now, there are some people in this world who say that man Jesus never actually died, but you know, the Romans knew what they were doing when it came to killing people, when it came to crucifying people, and Jesus was most assuredly dead, and his body was most assuredly laid in that tomb, but he did not stay in that tomb. Instead, he had been raised from the dead. And the disciples had also seen the resurrected Jesus in the upper room. Remember, there were 11 of them there, or 10 of them there at one point, and Thomas wasn't with them. And so after the disciples had seen, the 10 had seen Jesus the first time, they told Thomas, and Thomas said, I'm not going to believe it unless I see him myself, unless I put my hands in the scars. I'm not going to believe it. And then Jesus came and appeared to the 11. And then Thomas was told not to doubt, but instead to believe. And so the disciples, again, believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They knew that he had been raised. But they had dedicated their lives to him. They had seen him crucified. They scattered. Peter had denied him 3 times, and again he fled as well. They had turned around and they had hung together for a little while, and they had seen the resurrected Jesus in the upper room twice. But what do you do from there? What do you do from there when you've seen all that you've seen, and you've been through all that you've been through, and you've been hurt as bad as you've been hurt? What do? Well, Peter decided to go home. Peter decided to go home. He went back to the Sea of Galilee. And when he got back home, he decided to do what he had always been doing. This is important for us to remember. I want you to key in on this. Peter goes home, and in John chapter 21 and verse 4, he says to the disciples that he's going to go fishing. He's going to go fishing. Well, I'm going to go back. I've been through all of this. I gave all of this up. I dedicated myself to Jesus. I saw Jesus go to the cross. I saw him go to the tomb. He came out of the tomb, so I know he's not dead. But what do I do? So he goes back home, and he goes back fishing. Now, this is not recreational fishing. This is commercial fishing. He's going back to his former occupation, and some of the others decide to go back with him. They decide to go with him. Assuredly, we know John was there, and probably Andrew, and probably James, and who knows, maybe some of the other 11 that were left were there with those. And so they went back fishing. Why would they do that? Why would they go back to what they had known after everything that they had been through? Well, I can promise you, as somebody who studied human nature over a decade or two, I can tell you when things go wrong, when things go bad, when things get tough, when challenges come, people have the tendency to go back to what they're most familiar. They go back. They return back to old habits. They return back to old friends. They return back to old ways of life. They go back to something that's familiar, even if it's not all that good. They go back to it. And we see here that Peter and James and Andrew and John are no different than you or I. And when things have gone bad, when things have turned out to not be exactly as they expected, they go back to what they had known and what they had done before. And this is where Jesus finds them. Jesus meets them at the sea. We read in John chapter 21, starting at verse 4, Jesus coming back to meet them. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. There was a distance. Remember, they were about 100 yards offshore, we understand. And Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" And they answered him, "No." Now look at what's happening here. They go back to what's familiar, what they had done for so many years before meeting Jesus. They're out there, they're fishing, and they aren't catching anything. Everything has gone wrong. I'm going back to what I have done before, and now, after I had left it all behind, I had gone and I'd done all of these other things, and all of that had gone wrong. I go back to what's familiar, and what's familiar isn't even going right. They'd been out there all night, and they hadn't caught anything. And so Jesus cries out to them, he asks them, "Do you have any fish?" They said, "No." I don't know who they thought Jesus might have been until John recognizes who it is in a few moments, in a couple of verses. But this stranger standing on the shore cries out to him, and he says to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." It sounds like marching around the city 13 times and shouting and blowing horns and watching the walls fall down, right? That's a plan that only somebody who has some power to affect some things might put into place. We don't know the conversation on the boat. Maybe they said, "It's worth one more cast. It's worth one more throw of the net to see what we get." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. I don't know. I've never fished so much where the side of the boat specifically matters. What you're casting toward, maybe it matters. And maybe Jesus is telling them to cast somewhere unexpected. There shouldn't be fish over here. But we'll try it out. We'll see. Continuing on, we read, that disciple whom Jesus loved, that's the Apostle John, therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." John recognizes the wisdom, the divine wisdom of the Creator, of the divinity, telling them where the fish are at. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Peter is on his way to see Jesus. Remember, Peter ran to the tomb. John outran Peter, but when Peter got there, he went in first. When Jesus was walking on the water, Peter wanted to walk on the water with him. When the guards came to arrest Jesus, Peter was the first one to pull out his sword and to strike out at them. So Peter was the first one who was going to go make his way to shore. He had already seen Jesus twice since the resurrection. But now he gets to see him again. This man that he had left everything behind for at one point was now there on the shore after the resurrection talking to him again. And so he goes to see him. Now, instead of reading the entire chapter, we're going to summarize a few of these things. We see first or next that the disciples make their way to the shore and meet Jesus. They make the way. Now, they're not able to haul the net into the boat, but they can bring the net behind the boat with them. So fish are coming to shore with the other disciples. Peter is already making his way to shore, swimming his way in. And Jesus asks them to bring some of their fish so they could eat. He was making breakfast for them, wanted to add some fish. And we read a little bit further down, after Jesus had asked them to bring the fish, in verse 11, that there were 153 fish in that net. They hadn't caught anything all night. Nothing. And here they are bringing more fish than they may have otherwise caught all night, on a good night, in one net full. They're dragging it all behind. That is a lot of fish. That is a lot of money to be earned from the fish. That is a reestablishment of themselves as fishermen. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Because we pick the chapter up here in verse 6. Jesus asks the question. He said, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John," or Jonas, remember, "do you love me more than these?" Now, there are a few verses that are skipped, all the way up to verse 15. There are a few things that are skipped, and if you look in most copies of the Bible today, most modern translations, you will see that there is a division that men have put in there between verse 14 and verse 15, and it kind of breaks up the thought of what's going on here. But you see, these things are all connected. And so when Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love these more than me?" What are the these Jesus is talking to Peter about? We have to ask the question, what do these mean? So we can understand what Jesus is asking Peter, and we can understand Peter's response. There are only a few options here available. The first one that people might automatically think about was the other disciples. Remember, there were the other disciples, maybe not all of them, but a good number of them were with them in the boat fishing. They didn't have any luck, and they all came back to shore, and they were eating breakfast that Jesus had fixed for them. They cooked some of the fish that they had caught, and all of this was great and well and good. And Jesus maybe asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these guys that are standing around you?" Maybe. Maybe it was his family. We know Andrew was his family. Maybe he had gone back and maybe his family members were there and had given him the boat and given him the nets, and they had gotten their old equipment back out and were back out fishing again. And so maybe it was his family that was around him. Maybe. Or perhaps the fish. John makes a very specific point to tell us they caught a whole net full. So big they couldn't get it in the boat. So big the nets were straining. 153 of these fish were in the net. Why did John make such a big deal about the number of fish? Well, because it's important to the question that's being asked. Peter, do you love me more than all these fish that you've just caught? Well, and we would think to ourselves, that's a dumb question, right? We can definitely say the fish aren't as important as another person. Much more important would the Savior of the world be. But Jesus, being Jesus, asks very important questions. And there's nothing super simple about the questions that Jesus is asking. So what is so important about the fish that made Jesus ask Peter about the fish? Do you love these fish? Well, that was a lot of fish. That was a lot of fish that could have brought in a lot of money. They could have reestablished a family business. They could have put Peter back into his normal routine. It would have put Peter squarely back in his former life. All these fish, all the fish one could possibly catch in one night, with one cast, doing what you used to do, doing what your family's done for years, doing what you did before Jesus called you. This all represents Peter, and by extension, Andrew and James and John's former life. This could have easily been Jesus going back to the tax collector's table and asking Matthew again, do you love this money more than you love me? Do you love doing this job more than you love me? You see, the question was not about the fish. The fish were just the object lesson. The question was about following Christ. That's it. That's the question. Do you love me, Peter, more than you love this former life that you're floating back towards? It's not a simple question. It is, in fact, one of the more difficult questions, one of the more difficult struggles that we see someone fighting against. We see Peter's response to Jesus in verse 15. He says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Now again, this is an interesting reply from Peter to Jesus, because Peter is making some claims. Peter, when he is confronted with a question, he is forced to choose. And Peter, being forced to choose, then tells Jesus, "Yes, you know that I love you." You know it. It's here. It's obvious. It's apparent. I just jumped off the side of a boat to come swim up and meet you. Peter tells Jesus that he loves him more than his former life. More than leaving the conflict and the turmoil behind. More than all of the benefits that he could have from being peaceful again in his life. From being away from the ups and downs, from the successes and the losses, from the failures and the turmoil and the tears that the gospel is going to bring you. But instead, this is Peter's statement of loyalty to Jesus, to the gospel, and to his mission. Peter knew what the question was really all about. Do you love me more than you love these things that are around you, this former life that you've gone back to? Are you loyal to me beyond what you have in front of you? And Peter says, "Lord, you know that I love you." And at the end of verse 15, Jesus says, "Feed my lambs. Feed my sheep." Now, Jesus asks Peter this question 2 more times. Do you love me? You know that I love you. Do you love me? Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs. Feed my sheep. Peter's distraught by those two questions, by the same question 2 more times. However, he has resolved to follow. It's like the hymn we sing, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. Though none go with me, I still will follow. Peter was resolved to follow. And Jesus puts Peter back to work. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, tend my sheep. It's extremely powerful to know what Peter has decided to do, how he has decided to follow Jesus, and a powerful lesson for us today. Because we are also confronted with difficult times and with difficult choices in our lives. To kind of tie this into what's going on around us today, there are a lot of things that are going wrong. There are a lot of things that are going sideways. There are a lot of people who are doing and saying a lot of things that are showing the stress and the difficulties and the challenges that are weighing on them right now. There are a lot of decisions that are being made rashly. There are a lot of biases, political biases, family biases, cultural biases that are being pushed to the forefront. People are becoming more and more of who they really are at their core. And these difficulties and these challenges are there in front of us, and we are having to make these stark and difficult choices. Just like Peter, his life was turned upside down twice. Once when he heard Jesus come and called him by the gospel message, and another time when the gospel was turned upside down when Jesus went to that cross of Calvary. And now here he is, after giving up everything, turning his life over to Jesus, having all of that turned upside down, and now he's being asked, are you going to follow me again? And we see what Peter has chosen to do. Even to the point of where he gives his life for the gospel of Christ. You see, in our lives, Jesus calls us for the first time through the gospel message. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready to give up what we have to follow after him? Remember, there were those when Jesus called to them, they said, oh, hey, I would love to go. But let me go bury my father first. Let me make sure that my family situation is squared away before I follow you. Let me go do this. Let me go take care of that. Let me worry about all of these other things before I follow you. Are you ready to give those things up to follow Jesus? And we are called again when times are hard. And it's not going to happen once or twice or 2 or 3 or 4 times. It's going to happen over and over again in the life of a child of God. If you've been a Christian for any length of time, you know what I'm talking about. You know that there are going to be worldwide troubles. You know that there are going to be local problems. You know that there are going to be family problems. You know that there are going to be employment problems. You know that there's going to be social problems. You know that there are going to be personal problems. But through each one of those, the call comes out and we're asked, are you going to continue to follow Jesus? Am I going to take up my cross daily, every single day, and follow after him? Am I going to let my Christianity shine through the difficulties that I'm going through right now? Or am I going to go back? Am I going to go back to who I was before the gospel? Am I going to go back to what I did before the gospel? Am I going to go back to behave the same way I did before the gospel? Do I love my old life more than I love following Christ? We have to decide every single day. Am I going to put anything in front of Christ? Am I going to put the things of this world before Him? Am I going to put my personal desires before Him? Am I going to put my political beliefs before Him? Am I going to put my recreational activities before Him? Am I going to put my own family before Him? Am I going to put my job before Him? Do I love Him more than these? Peter determined that he loved Jesus more than those fish. All 153 of them. And he was going to leave that net and that boat and those fish and that family behind again if he needed to continue to follow after Jesus. Because Peter had a job to do. He had to go feed Jesus' lambs. He had to go feed the sheep. We are called, each and every one of us today, to continue following after Jesus. Peter had a choice. Follow Jesus or go backwards. We have a choice today as well. Are we going to continue following Jesus, or are we going to continue going backwards? Are we going to hold on to the life that's ahead of us and the hope of a home eternal in heaven with Him in the end? Or are we going to cling to the things of this world? I pray that each and every one of us are ready to lay the things of this world aside, to put them behind, and press forward to the high calling of Christ Jesus. Even the Apostle Paul, he tells us that we have to count all those things behind us as lost. We have to forget about them, and we have to keep pushing toward the prize of the high calling. We have to run the race. We have to finish the course. And we have to keep the faith. Peter did put aside the things of this life. And we read a little bit later on in the book of Acts, where he and the other disciples went back to Jerusalem. And there they waited after Christ ascended back into heaven until the power of the Holy Spirit came upon them, and Peter stood up with the 12 and preached the first gospel sermon, using the keys to the kingdom to bring others to Christ. I hope that you have been able to gain something from today's lesson. I appreciate everyone who has been so good and so encouraging about me putting these lessons online. I hope that you are gaining something from them. And I hope that you will continue to encourage one another to keep pressing forward toward following the gospel, toward following after Christ, and toward continuing the mission that He has set you on the course of. I hope that each and every one of us continue to call Christ our Lord and our Savior. And I hope to meet you again here soon. Please let me know if you need anything, if there's anything I can do to help you. I'm just a phone call or a message away. God bless each and every one of you. I love every one of you, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.